Having received the higher knowledge, Janaka now speaks from direct experience. His words reveal the depth of realization, freedom, detachment, and a peace entirely beyond all dualities.
It really is the exact moment where theory becomes reality.
Exactly. And before we step into that reality, I want to quickly ask that if you find yourself captivated by this journey today, take a second to subscribe, leave a like, and drop your reflections down in the comments. We're always reading them, and the community here is just incredible.
It really is, yeah.
So welcome to this deep dive into the Ashtavakra Samhita, which is also widely known as the Ashtavakra Gita. Today, we are exploring one of the most remarkable sections of ancient literature you will ever encounter. We're looking at Chapter 7, titled Disciples' Realization, utilizing the incredibly clear translation and commentary by Swami Nityaswarapananda.
And what we are looking at today is a radical shift. It's the moment an intellectual understanding of the universe suddenly, it just clicks into a lived, breathing reality.
Right, because usually when we read ancient philosophy, we're reading the words of the master.
Yeah, we read the teacher handing down the law, explaining the architecture of the cosmos. But Chapter 7 completely flips the script. We stop hearing from the teacher entirely.
Which is so rare for these texts. We actually start hearing the direct, unfiltered experience of the student, King Janaka.
Exactly. We're getting a first-person account of what it actually feels like to wake up from the illusion of the human ego.
But to really grasp the gravity of Janaka's awakening, we have to start with the teacher who woke him up. We have to look at the sage Ashtavakra.
Oh, absolutely. If you don't understand where this man came from, you miss the profound irony and the central metaphor of his entire philosophy.
His origin story comes to us from the epic Mahabharata, specifically the Vanaparva. So let's travel back to ancient India. Picture a society where knowledge isn't stored on hard drives or even written in books.
Right. It is stored entirely in the human mind. The Vedas, the most sacred texts of this culture, were passed down orally.
And this required absolute, flawless precision. A single mispronounced syllable wasn't just a mistake. It was considered a cosmic error that could disrupt the harmony of the universe.
The pressure on the scholars of that era was immense. You weren't just a student. You were the living vessel for eternal truths. Your mind and your voice had to be perfect instruments.
So we have this highly respected scholar named Kahor. He is sitting beside his pregnant wife, Sujata, and he is meticulously chanting the Vedas, practicing his recitations.
And suddenly a voice interrupts him, but it's not a student in the room.
No, the voice is coming from his wife's womb. He is his unborn child.
Which is just an incredible visual.
Right. And the child says, "Father, even lying in my mother's womb, I have already learned all the Vedas through your grace, but I regret that you often make mistakes in your recitation."
You really have to pause and consider the absolute psychological devastation of that moment for Kahor.
Oh, total devastation.
He is a master, a man whose entire identity, his ego, his social standing, it's all built on his flawless mastery of these texts, and he is being corrected by a fetus.
It's the ultimate blow to human pride.
It's complete ego destruction.
Yeah.
And Kahor does not handle it well.
Not at all. The text tells us he takes this as a grave insult. In a fit of immense rage and wounded pride, he curses his own unborn child.
He basically declares that because the child was so twisted as to insult his father, he will be born physically twisted.
He curses the boy to be born with 8 severe physical deformities. And in this ancient context, a curse of this magnitude from a learned scholar carries absolute weight.
So when the child is born, his body is violently contorted, his limbs, his spine, his joints, 8 distinct curves in his physical form.
Which is where he gets his name. Ashta meaning 8, and Vakra meaning curved or bent.
And this is where the core philosophy of the text begins, right here in the biology of the teacher. Well, in ancient society, a severe physical deformity was often interpreted as a manifestation of terrible past karma. The society would look at this broken, twisted body and immediately judge the soul inside it as flawed or cursed or lesser.
Right, they just saw the outside.
Exactly. Ashtavakra is born into a world that will judge him entirely by his gross physical form. But what is inside that bent frame? A consciousness of terrifying clarity.
A pure, unblemished, infinite intelligence.
Yes. The physical body is a prison of 8 curves, but the mind is utterly free. This is the central thesis of the Ashtavakra Gita, the absolute distinction between the temporary physical shell we inhabit and the eternal, perfect consciousness that observes it.
It's like we are all, in a sense, walking around defining ourselves by our own curves.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like our physical flaws, our aging bodies, our social anxieties, our limited brains. We identify with the bent vessel and completely ignore the pure light shining inside of it.
And the universe just continues to test this family because a few years later, Kahor, the father, falls into extreme poverty.
Right, so he travels to the court of King Janaka, which was essentially the intellectual capital of the ancient world.
Janaka was famous for hosting these massive, high-stakes philosophical debates, and the undisputed champion of this court is a scholar named Vandi.
So Kahor challenges Vandi to a debate, hoping to win wealth for his family, but he loses.
He loses badly. And the penalty for losing isn't just a bruised ego. Vandi has a brutal rule. The losers are thrown into the sea to serve as priests in an underwater sacrifice.
So Kahor is drowned.
It is a tragic irony. The man who cursed his son out of intellectual pride is ultimately destroyed by his own intellectual inadequacy. The ego that demanded perfection is drowned in the sea.
Fast forward a bit. Ashtavakra grows up. When he is 12 years old, he finally learns the truth about what happened to his father.
And he decides immediately that he must go to King Janaka's court. He travels there with his uncle.
Now imagine this scene. The gates of the greatest intellectual arena in the world. Guards are stationed there, tasked with keeping out the riffraff.
And up walks a 12-year-old boy whose body is so severely deformed he can barely walk straight.
The guards take one look at his physical form and refuse to let him in. They judge the book entirely by its broken cover.
But Ashtavakra doesn't use physical force to get in. He doesn't throw a tantrum. He simply begins to speak.
He engages the guards, and eventually the king himself, with such a profound, crystalline command of the most complex scriptures, the Shastras, that the entire court is rendered speechless.
The superficial illusion of his physical body completely evaporates in the face of his overwhelming intellectual and spiritual presence.
He demands to debate Vandi, the man who defeated his father. The king allows it, and a massive philosophical controversy unfolds.
This 12-year-old, physically twisted boy systematically dismantles the arguments of the greatest scholar in the land. He completely outmaneuvers Vandi, wins the debate, and forces Vandi to release his father.
When Kahor emerges from the water, he is so humbled, so utterly stripped of his previous ego, that he instructs his son to bathe in the river Samanga.
Ashtavakra does, and miraculously, the water heals his physical deformities. He steps out of the river with a perfectly straight body.
But, and I find this detail so important, he keeps the name Ashtavakra for the rest of his life.
Right. He keeps the name because he knows the shape of the body never actually mattered. Crooked or straight, the pure consciousness inside was always exactly the same.
His victory at Janaka's court wasn't just a son avenging his father. It was the ultimate demonstration of his philosophy.
He proved in real time that knowledge is entirely independent of the physical form. King Janaka witnesses this. He watches the boy bypass every societal hierarchy, every physical limitation, through the sheer, undeniable force of pure awareness.
Janaka realizes he isn't looking at a smart kid. He is looking at a liberated master. And right then and there, the king of this massive empire bows down and becomes the disciple of the 12-year-old boy.
And that really brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today.
Exactly, because we are fast-forwarding through their initial lessons, moving straight to Chapter 7. Because Chapter 7 is the pivot.
It is the exact moment where King Janaka stops being a student taking notes and starts being a master himself.
He transitions from understanding the mechanics of liberation to actually embodying that liberation.
So our goal today is to examine the anatomy of that psychological shift. How does human consciousness actually transform from being trapped in anxiety and ego into a state of absolute, unshakable freedom?
To understand the magnitude of Janaka's transformation, we first have to rigorously define what he is transforming out of.
Right. In the very first chapter of the text, Ashtavakra lays down a definition of bondage that is incredibly precise, and it has nothing to do with physical chains or prison cells or even difficult life circumstances.
As you listen, try to pay close attention to how Janaka talks about what was actually holding him back. Because if bondage isn't physical, what is it?
Well, according to Swami Nityananda's translation of the text, bondage consists of only two interconnected psychological states: desire and the ignorance of identifying the self with the body and the mind.
That is the entirety of the human trap.
It is the ego. Now, to explain how this traps us, the commentary uses a brilliant analogy from optics. It describes the ego as pure consciousness that has been limited and distorted by the mind in the exact same way that pure light is distorted by a glass prism.
Okay, let's unpack this prism analogy because it's so helpful. In physics, if you have a beam of pure white light, that light contains all possibilities, but it has no distinct color of its own. It is unified.
Right.
But the moment you pass that white light through a triangular glass prism, the glass slows down the light. It forces the light to bend, a process called refraction.
And because different wavelengths of light bend at slightly different angles, that single unified beam shatters. It exits the prism as a spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet.
Like the Dark Side of the Moon album cover. A singular reality is suddenly fractured into a multiplicity of different separated things.
That is a perfect description of the cognitive mechanism of the human ego. In this ancient philosophy, the pure white light is the self. It is Brahman, pure awareness, the fundamental fabric of consciousness.
It is unified, perfect, and completely without boundaries.
The glass prism is the human mind and its neurological architecture. When pure, unbound awareness filters through the biological machinery of the brain, through our memories, our trauma, our sensory organs, it gets refracted.
It bends.
And it shatters into the illusion of multiplicity. The singular awareness suddenly fractures into me and you. It splinters into my career, my physical pain, my reputation, my desires.
And because we are constantly looking at the colorful rainbow projected on the wall, we become completely hypnotized by it.
We think the red light of our anger is who we are. We think the blue light of our sadness is who we are.
We completely forget that we are actually the singular, invisible light source that is simply illuminating the prism.
Exactly. We identify entirely with the fractured output. This is what the text means by ignorance. It isn't a lack of intelligence. It is a fundamental misidentification.
You think you are the body that gets sick and ages. You think you are the mind that gets anxious and depressed.
And the moment you identify with those fragile, temporary things, you are in bondage. You are enslaved to the preservation of a phantom.
You spend your entire life terrified of the prism breaking, not realizing that if the prism breaks, the light doesn't die. It just returns to being unbound.
That fear of the prism breaking is the root of all human suffering.
Yeah, if my entire identity is tied up in being a successful executive, what happens when I lose my job? My reality collapses.
Right. If your identity is tied up in being physically attractive, what happens when you age? You suffer endlessly.
But in Chapter 7, Janaka experiences a radical cognitive shift. He looks at his own mind and says, aha, I see the glass.
He declares that he has long been in the noose of body consciousness, but that he is now completely free.
He announces that he is beyond desire, beyond sorrow, and beyond the illusion of the world.
He realizes the noose he felt around his neck was woven entirely out of his own misidentification. He hasn't changed the physical world. He is still a king. He still has a kingdom to run. He still has a physical body. But the psychological gravity of those things has vanished.
Okay, let's unpack this, though, because it's easy to throw around words like illusion. If a person is dreaming that they are tied up, the ropes aren't real, but the panic absolutely is. Is Janaka just waking up from the dream?
That is the most crucial pushback to this entire philosophy. And the text addresses it through what is arguably the most famous analogy in all of Vedanta, the rope and the snake.
Oh, I love this one.
We have to look at the neurology of fear to really understand this. Imagine you are walking down a dirt path at dusk. The light is incredibly dim. You look down, and right in your path, you see a thick, coiled shape.
Your brain's visual cortex processes the shape, sends an immediate signal to your amygdala, the brain's fear center, and within milliseconds, before you even have a conscious thought, your body initiates a massive survival cascade.
The fight-or-flight response.
Yeah.
Your adrenal glands pump cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your heart rate skyrockets to pump blood to your muscles.
Your pupils dilate. Your digestion completely shuts down. You are standing on that path, completely paralyzed by absolute undeniable terror. You are completely in bondage to the thread of that snake.
And every single physiological response you just described is 100% real. The terror is real. The chemical cascade is real. The suffering is real.
But then, a friend walks up behind you with a powerful flashlight.
They shine the beam directly onto the coiled shape on the ground. And in the harsh light, you see clearly that it is not a venomous snake at all.
It is just a frayed, dirty piece of rope that someone discarded.
The biological reaction was completely real, but the stimulus causing it was a total fabrication of the mind operating in the dark.
Right. The snake never existed. Not for a single second. It only appeared to exist because of the darkness of the environment and the predictive machinery of your brain, which is wired to assume danger to keep you alive.
That false prediction caused genuine suffering. But here is the critical part of the analogy. When the flashlight illuminates the rope, what happens to the snake?
It doesn't slither away into the bushes.
No, you don't have to fight it. You don't have to negotiate with it. It vanishes instantly because it was never there to begin with.
And the terror vanishes with it. Your heart rate drops. The adrenaline recedes. You are free.
The Ashtavakra Gita argues that our entire psychological relationship with the world, our rigid identities, our desperate desires, our existential dread is the snake.
It appears terrifyingly real in the darkness of our ignorance.
In our misidentification with the ego, yes. But when the light of true self-knowledge dawns, when you realize you are the eternal, pure consciousness, the terrifying realities of the world are revealed to be just ropes.
The world itself doesn't disappear. The rope is still lying on the path. You still have a body. You still have a job. But your terrified, enslaved relationship to those things vanishes entirely.
I want you to really think about how this applies to the machinery of your own life. What are the snakes that are currently paralyzing you?
Maybe it's an email from your boss that says, "We need to talk." And your brain instantly hallucinates a snake called, "I'm getting fired, I'll be bankrupt, I'm a failure."
Your body floods with stress hormones, you lose sleep, you suffer. But the reality is just a rope, a digital transmission of text.
The entire narrative of destruction was a snake projected by your ego's fear for its own survival. Janaka's realization is the turning on of the flashlight.
He sees that the anxieties, the pressures of ruling a kingdom, the fear of death, they are all just ropes. He stops suffering because he stops projecting snakes.
But seeing the rope is only the first step. The natural question that follows is about mechanics. Once Janaka turns on the flashlight, once he realizes he is not his body and not his anxious mind, what actually happens to his cognitive processes?
Right, if you strip away the ego's survival drive, what is driving the machine of the human being?
And that leads us to a fascinating progression in the text. How does the mind of a realized person actually operate?
As we move into this, pay attention to his description of detachment from his body and mind. Because in chapter 7, verse 1, Janaka describes a highly specific sequence of internal shutdown.
Listen to the order of operations here. He says that because of his realization, he first became intolerant of physical action, then of extensive speech, and then of thought.
We have to stop right away and define the word intolerant, because in our modern lexicon, intolerance is a toxic word. We associate it with bigotry, anger, and a rigid, hateful mind.
But in the translation notes by Swami Nityaswarupananda, he makes it explicitly clear that the Sanskrit intent here carries zero anger.
It does not mean a resentful hatred of the world. A much better translation for our modern ears would be profoundly detached or indifferent.
It's the kind of intolerance you feel when you completely outgrow something. Think about a pacifier for a toddler. To a 2-year-old, the pacifier is the center of the universe.
If they lose it, they scream in absolute agony. Their bondage to that piece of plastic is total.
But when that child turns 10, they don't hate the pacifier. They aren't angry at it. They're simply completely intolerant of the idea of putting it in their mouth.
They have realized it holds no actual nourishment. The illusion of its value has broken.
That is a perfect analogy. Janaka is looking at the fundamental activities of human life, doing, talking, and thinking, and realizing they are all pacifiers.
They belong entirely to the relative world, the world of the fractured prism. They have absolutely zero ability to affect the pure, infinite consciousness that he truly is.
And because he sees their ultimate irrelevance, the desperate compulsion to engage in them just evaporates. Let's trace that sequence he mentions, because it maps perfectly onto the architecture of the nervous system.
It moves from the grossest, most outward manifestation down to the most subtle, internal sparks of electricity.
First, he becomes detached from physical action. This is the gross level. Think about how much of our physical running around is driven by the ego trying to secure its position.
We hustle, we grind, we acquire, we physically manipulate our environment trying to build a fortress of safety for our identity.
Janaka realizes his true self cannot be harmed or improved, so the frantic, desperate need to do things physically falls away.
Once the physical body stills, he moves a layer deeper, to the subtle outward expression, extensive speech.
Why do we talk so much? Why do we argue in comment sections? Why do we gossip? Why do we constantly explain ourselves to others?
It is almost always the ego demanding to be validated, understood, or proven right. It is a defense mechanism.
Janaka realizes there is nothing left to defend. The truth is self-evident. So the compulsion to constantly vibrate his vocal cords, to manipulate the opinions of others, vanishes.
And finally, he hits the deepest, most subtle layer thought itself. He becomes detached from the internal churning of the mind.
In modern neuroscience, we talk a lot about the default mode network, or the DMN. This is the network in the brain that lights up when we aren't doing a specific task. It's the source of our mind wandering.
And what does the DMN do? It constantly simulates the future to predict threats, and it constantly dwells on the past to regret mistakes.
It is the ego's simulation machine, constantly spinning narratives of me. Janaka takes what the text calls the sword of knowledge and severs his identification with this biological simulation.
He stops believing the thoughts. He severs the noose of body consciousness. He stops being the mind and rests purely as the intelligence that observes the mind.
Wait, if I apply this logically to a modern human being, I run into a massive wall.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I use this sword of knowledge to detach from my physical actions, and then I detach from speaking to anyone, and then I systematically detach from even forming thoughts in my own brain, aren't I just a rock?
This raises an important question, right?
How is that liberation? It sounds like a coma. If I am completely detached from action, speech, and thought, how do I live in the modern world? Does enlightenment just mean becoming a vegetable?
You're hitting on the single most common and most vital criticism of Vedantic philosophy. And if the text stopped at intolerant of thought, you would be absolutely right. It would be a philosophy of nihilistic paralysis.
Right.
But Janaka immediately clarifies his state. In verse 2, he doesn't say he has gone deaf or blind. He says he has no attachment for sound, etc., and that his mind is free from distraction and one-pointed.
So his senses are still functioning.
The key distinction here is that detachment is not the destruction of the sensory organs or the brain. It is the liberation of them from the tyranny of the ego's narrative.
Let's break down exactly how that works in real time. Give me a concrete example of hearing a sound with attachment versus hearing it without attachment.
Let's use the sound of an ambulance siren. If you are sitting in your living room and you hear a siren blazing past your window, how does an ordinary attached mind react?
The eardrum vibrates, the brain registers the sound, and instantly the default mode network hijacks the signal.
The ego starts spinning a narrative. Oh no, a terrible accident. I wonder if it's on the main highway. If it is, my commute tomorrow is going to be ruined. I'm going to be late for that meeting. My boss is going to be furious. Why does everything always go wrong for me?
The sound wave hits your ear, and 3 seconds later, you are suffering anxiety about losing your job.
The sound is completely entangled with your ego's fear of the future. You are in bondage to the sound.
Now contrast that with Janaka's state.
He still hears the siren. His auditory cortex works perfectly. But he has no attachment to the sound.
The sound wave hits the ear, the brain registers siren, and it stops there.
Exactly. There is no ego to hijack the signal. There is no simulation of the future commute. There is no neurotic narrative about the boss.
He simply experiences the pure auditory reality of the siren rising and falling in the present moment.
He is completely present with reality as it actually is, rather than reality as his ego fears it might be.
So detaching from thought doesn't mean your brain flatlines. It means you stop writing every single thought like an emotional roller coaster.
In cognitive behavioral therapy, this sounds a lot like the concept of cognitive diffusion.
Yes, exactly. You learn to observe a thought like, I am a failure. Not as a statement of absolute truth that you must react to, but simply as a string of words your brain generated.
You watch the thoughts pass through the mind like clouds across a sky.
The sky doesn't get wet when a rain cloud passes through it. The sky just holds the space. Janaka has become the sky.
Or, to use a classic Eastern analogy, he has become a perfect mirror. Think about how a mirror operates. When you place a beautiful blooming rose in front of a mirror, the mirror reflects it perfectly in high definition. But the mirror doesn't try to grasp the rose. It doesn't cling to it.
And if you take the rose away and replace it with a terrifying, hideous mask, the mirror reflects the mask perfectly.
But the mirror isn't traumatized. It doesn't contract in fear. And when the mask is removed, there is no lingering imprint of the horror.
The mirror simply returns to its natural state of clear, empty readiness. Janaka is saying his mind has become this mirror. He interacts with the world perfectly, but nothing sticks.
This brings up a massive ontological question. If the mirror no longer identifies with the reflections passing across its surface, if Janaka looks at his hands, his words, and his anxieties and says, that is not me, then what exactly is he?
When you strip away every single defining characteristic of a human life, what is the core that remains?
This is where Chapter 7 moves from psychological detachment to breathtaking cosmic expansion. We move from the anatomy of the mind to the architecture of reality itself.
Notice his affirmation of abiding is pure consciousness here. Because Janaka doesn't just say, I am nothing. He says the exact opposite.
Listen to the scale of what he claims to be.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He has this massive breakthrough and declares, in me, the limitless ocean, diverse waves of worlds are produced forthwith on the rising of the wind of the mind.
Every single noun in that metaphor is deeply intentional and warrants dissection. He starts with the limitless ocean. This represents pure consciousness, the Atman, the fundamental ground of being.
An ocean is vast, deep, and at its core it is completely silent and undisturbed by the weather on the surface.
Janaka identifies himself as this bottomless depth of awareness.
And then we introduce motion. What causes an ocean to form waves? It isn't the water itself, it's an external force. It's the wind.
In Janaka's metaphor, the wind is the mind. The activity of the brain, the churning of thoughts, the processing of sensory data, all of this acts like a wind blowing across the surface of that infinite consciousness.
And what happens when the wind of the mind hits the ocean of consciousness? It stirs up waves.
But Janaka doesn't just say it creates small ripples. He says the wind produces diverse waves of worlds.
Diverse waves of worlds, the absolute scale of that. The mind isn't just creating little thoughts.
Yeah.
It is generating entire realities.
The universe as we experience it, the planets, the people, the drama, the history, are all just temporary waveforms bubbling up on the surface of awareness.
But the most radical part of this entire statement is the very first two words, in me.
Yes. That is the ultimate inversion of human perception. Normally, our ego dictates that we are the wave.
We look at the massive, terrifying universe and we feel like a tiny, fragile little ripple of water.
We are born, we get tossed around by the chaotic currents of history and society, we peak for a moment, and then we crash onto the shore of death and disappear back into the void. It is a terrifying way to live.
But Janaka completely flips the script. He realizes he was never the wave. He is the water.
He is the ocean. He realizes that the entire universe is actually happening inside of him. Space and time are just dimensions of the waves, but he is the substance they are made of.
Ashtavakra taught him this earlier in the text using another classic analogy, the ether, or space, inside a clay jar.
Imagine you have a potter who makes a clay jar and seals it. Now you have space inside the jar and you have space outside the jar.
To a naive observer, the clay jar has trapped the space. It had cut a piece of space off from the rest of the universe.
But if you take a hammer and smash the clay jar into pieces, what happens to the space that was inside? Does it spill out? Does it break?
No, because the space was never actually divided. The space was always continuous, unbroken, and completely unaffected by the clay walls that were temporarily built around it.
The space inside the jar was always one with the space outside.
Exactly. The pure consciousness that Janaka has realized, the eternal Brahman, is like that space. Your physical body, your skull, your ego is the clay jar.
It creates the temporary illusion that your consciousness is separated from everything else, trapped inside a meat suit.
But Janaka has used the hammer of knowledge to shatter the jar of the ego. He realizes his awareness exists inside all things and outside all things.
Yeah.
He is what the text calls the eternal witness.
The eternal witness. Let's really ground that in your immediate experience as a listener. If you are listening to my voice right now, there is a physical process happening.
Sound waves are hitting your ear, converting to electrical signals, and your brain is decoding English words.
But beneath all that biological machinery, there is a silent awareness that is watching the listening happen. Think about your life. When you were 5 years old, you had a certain body and a certain set of thoughts.
When you were 20, your body was completely different. Your cells had regenerated. Your thoughts and beliefs were entirely different.
Today, you are different again. Everything about your physical and mental reality has changed. But the witness, the pure sense of I am, the silent awareness that observed the 5-year-old and observed the 20-year-old and is observing you now, has not aged a single second.
It hasn't changed. It just watches.
The text is explicitly clear on this. The witness is not in the object, nor is the object in the witness. The pure light of intelligence simply illuminates the scene.
And because Janaka has shifted his identity from the changing wave to the unchanging water, from the fragile jar to the indestructible space, he understands that the events of his life, the creation and destruction of his personal worlds, don't actually alter his fundamental nature.
The depths of the Marianas Trench remain perfectly pitch black and still, regardless of a Category 5 hurricane raging on the surface above.
This is why he says he is completely free from sorrow. Think about the logic of it. How can the ocean mourn a wave?
A wave isn't a thing, it's an event. It's just water playing at being a shape for a moment before relaxing back into being water. The water never dies.
When you truly internalize this, it fundamentally alters how you process trauma and loss. You stop viewing the end of a wave as a tragedy and start viewing it as the natural physics of the mind's wind blowing across the surface of reality.
I challenge you to try this on as a psychological exercise tomorrow. Just for 1 hour, try moving through your life from the perspective of the ocean rather than the wave.
When you sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic and you feel that hot flash of road rage, ask yourself, is the eternal witness actually angry? Or is a temporary wave of adrenaline just rippling across the surface?
If a coworker insults you or undermines you in a meeting, instead of the ego leaping up to defend its fragile clay jar, can you view their insult as just a tiny gust of wind whipping up a momentary ripple on your infinite depth?
It completely neutralizes the threat. It strips the venom out of the snake. You realize there is nothing that needs defending.
It is a profound mental shift, and it brings an unshakable equanimity. But we cannot stop here, because this naturally leads us to the final and undoubtedly the most difficult aspect of this entire philosophy.
Right. Because it is one thing for us to analyze this metaphor intellectually in a deep dive. It is even one thing for a monk to sit on a quiet meditation cushion in the Himalayas, close his eyes, shut down his sensory inputs, and feel a sense of vast oceanic peace.
The real test of this knowledge is friction.
The friction of the real world. Yes.
Yeah.
It is one thing to conceptually understand the ether in the jar. It is another thing entirely to stand up from that cushion, walk into a chaotic, loud marketplace, govern an empire, balance a budget, deal with difficult people, as King Janaka actively had to do, and actually maintain that consciousness.
This is the crux of Chapter 7 and why it is so relevant for a modern audience. We are not monks in a cave. We are in the world. And the absolute insistence of this text is that true transformation is only valid when knowledge becomes lived experience.
If you could quote every verse of the Ashtavakra Gita in Sanskrit, but you still lose your temper and scream at a barista because your coffee order is wrong, your knowledge is utterly useless.
You haven't realized anything. You've just memorized a map. You haven't actually taken the journey. The realization must be physically and psychologically embodied.
Which brings us to the state of the liberated being in the real world. The text has a very specific term for someone who has achieved this embodiment while still living in a physical breathing body. They are known as a Jivanmukta.
Let's break that down. Jiva, meaning a living entity, an individual soul, and mukta, meaning liberated or freed. A Jivanmukta is someone who is fully enlightened but hasn't died yet. They're walking around among us.
In chapter 7, verse 8, Janaka describes this state with a beautiful sense of relief. He says, "Blessed is the man who has accomplished this. Blessed is he who is such by nature."
The critical phrase there is by nature. In the beginning of a spiritual or psychological practice, mindfulness requires immense effort. You have to constantly remind yourself to breathe, remind yourself not to react, remind yourself to be detached.
You are fighting the momentum of your own brain.
But Janaka is saying he has crossed the threshold. The absolute state of oceanic peace is no longer a technique he applies. It has become his default biological baseline. It is his nature.
I want to pull in a metaphor from chapter 18 of the text to really illustrate what the daily life of a Jivanmukta looks like, because it is incredibly poetic and paints a vivid picture of this effortlessness. The text says that a liberated person moves about the world like a dry leaf.
They are blown about purely by the wind of past actions. They are desireless, independent, and entirely free from the pairs of opposites. They treat pleasure and pain, success and failure with the exact same inner stillness.
The physics of the dry leaf metaphor is brilliant. Let's contrast it with a living green leaf. A green leaf is firmly attached to the branch of the tree. It is actively drawing sap. It is performing photosynthesis. And most importantly, when the wind blows, the green leaf resists.
It fights to stay attached. It holds on for dear life. That green leaf is the human ego. It is constantly grasping, trying to control outcomes, resisting the natural flow of reality, terrified of being detached from its identity.
But a dry leaf has undergone a fundamental transformation. Its connection to the tree, the ego's attachment to the material world, has been severed.
So when the wind blows hard to the east, the dry leaf doesn't fight. It simply glides east.
When the wind dies down and the leaf falls gently onto the grass, it rests there in complete peace. It doesn't wish it were back on the tree. It doesn't anxiety scroll about where the wind might take it tomorrow.
It simply surrenders perfectly to the physics of the present moment.
Now, what is the wind in this metaphor? If the Jivanmukta has no ego-driven desires, Why do they do anything at all? Why do they get out of bed?
In the Vedantic tradition, the wind blowing the dry leaf is the momentum of past karma, specifically deep psychological grooves called samskaras.
Let's translate samskars into modern neuroscience because it makes perfect sense. In neuroplasticity, there is a principle called Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together.
Every time you react to a situation with anger, you carve a microscopic neurological pathway in your brain. You wrap that pathway in myelin, making the signal travel faster next time.
Do that thousands of times over a lifetime, and you create a massive, deep groove of habit. You create a psychological momentum.
Those deep neurological grooves are your samskaras. Now, when Janaka achieves realization, he destroys the ego. He stops generating new karma, new desires, and new attachments.
But the physical body and the brain he inhabits still have the sheer momentum of all those past actions built up.
The Jivanmukta still has a heartbeat, a metabolism, and a role in society. The wind of that biological and societal momentum will continue to carry the physical body through its remaining lifespan.
The Jivanmukta will still eat, sleep, and in Janaka's case, govern a kingdom. But the inner awareness, the true self, is completely unconcerned with where the wind blows the body.
This directly answers the fear we brought up earlier about becoming a rock or slipping into a coma. The text goes out of its way to explicitly clarify this point. Action does not stop.
A Jivanmukta isn't blindfolded in a cave. The text says they still see, hear, touch, smell, eat, and walk. They interact with the physical world flawlessly.
But, and this is the absolute key to their liberation, they act while being free from efforts and non-efforts.
Free from efforts and non-efforts. This points to the concept of acting without the interference of the ego. Think about when you were learning a complex skill, like driving a manual transmission car or playing the piano.
In the beginning, it is pure effort. Your ego is heavily involved. Okay, press the clutch, shift the gear, slowly release. You are tense. You are anxious about stalling. You are hyper-aware of yourself.
But after 10 years of driving, what happens? You can drive across town, shift gears perfectly, navigate traffic, and arrive at your destination without having a single conscious thought about the act of driving.
The action happens perfectly, but there is no doer agonizing over it. It is effortless action.
In psychology, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls this the flow state. Elite athletes experience it. Jazz musicians improvising experience it.
The ego shuts down, the prefrontal cortex deactivates, and the body just does exactly what the moment requires with absolute fluid perfection.
The Jivanmukta lives their entire life in that state. When it is time to eat, eating happens. But there is no ego saying, I am a foodie. This meal defines my status.
When it is time to walk, walking happens, but there is no ego desperately trying to arrive at the destination first. To a mind operating without ego, the text says that earth, stone, or gold are viewed as exactly the same.
Because if you have realized that you are the infinite, limitless ocean of consciousness, how could a small chunk of shiny yellow metal possibly add to your value?
How could a gray stone make you any less infinite? The entire economic and social value system of the relative world completely collapses in the face of the absolute. You cannot bribe the ocean with a cup of water.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful. And because they want nothing from the world, they interact with the world with perfect grace. There is no hidden agenda. There is no manipulation.
There is no self-doubt muddying their decisions. Janaka can rule his kingdom, administer justice, and wage wars if necessary, purely based on what the present moment structurally requires, completely free from personal anger or greed.
Which brings this entire journey full circle, tying back to how Janaka started. In a later chapter, chapter 20, the text gives us one final, brilliant analogy to explain the arc of this spiritual evolution.
Janaka started exactly where you and I are starting today. He started by using his intellect. He listened to the teachings of his guru, Ashtavakra.
He engaged in deep philosophical arguments. He studied the metaphors of the prism, the rope, the ocean, and the jar. He used all of this intellectual machinery to seek the truth.
But eventually, Janaka says he had to extract the thorn of different disquisitions with the pincers of the knowledge of truth.
This is the analogy of using a thorn to remove a thorn. It is an incredibly practical image. Imagine you are walking barefoot in the woods and you step on a sharp thorn. It gets deeply embedded in your heel. It causes you constant pain and bondage.
Now, to get it out, you can't just use your blunt fingers. You might reach down, find another sharp thorn on the ground, and use that second thorn like a needle to dig into your skin and pry the first thorn out.
The first thorn is our ego, our ignorance, our identification with the body. That is what causes our suffering.
The second thorn is the philosophy. It is the Ashtavakra Gita. It is the debates, the scriptures, the podcasts, the deep dives, the meditation techniques.
We use the sharp intellectual tools of philosophy to dig out the deeply embedded ignorance of the ego.
But here is the critical part of the analogy. Once you have successfully used the second thorn to pry the first thorn out of your foot, what do you do with the two thorns? You don't keep the second one embedded in your skin.
You don't put it in your pocket to cherish it. You throw them both away.
You throw away the philosophy. You let go of the scaffolding once the house is built.
Exactly. The philosophical arguments are absolutely necessary to dig out the ignorance. But once you have realized the sheer truth of your infinite nature, you have to let go of the philosophy too.
You cannot carry the concepts of liberation and bondage around in your head forever because even those concepts are just thoughts. And as we established, Janaka became detached even from thoughts.
Janaka got tired of reasoning. He got tired of arguing about the nature of reality. He realized that talking about the water doesn't quench your thirst.
He simply dropped the intellectual thorns, let everything go, and arrived at absolute silent peace.
And that, right there, is exactly what Chapter 7 represents. It is the real-time record of King Janaka throwing away the second thorn. He is no longer analyzing his teacher's words. He is declaring his absolute, natural, lived freedom.
So what is the ultimate takeaway for us today? What does it mean for our messy, modern lives?
The core message is this. Realization is complete only when knowledge becomes lived freedom. It is not enough to intellectually understand that your ego acts like a prism. You have to do the hard work of living as the pure light.
It is not enough to understand the physics of the ocean and the waves. You have to fundamentally stop identifying your worth with the temporary rising and falling of your daily wave.
And the most hopeful part of this text is the insistence that this lived freedom isn't miles away. It isn't hidden at the end of a 30-year meditation retreat.
It is available right here, in every single moment, the exact second we stop projecting our hallucinatory snakes of fear onto the simple, pure reality of the rocks in front of us.
What a profound place to land. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to invite you to take these concepts off the screen and into your life. Jump into the comments and tell us, what is a snake in your life right now?
What is something that is causing you massive anxiety that you might recently have realized is actually just a harmless rope?
By articulating it, you help pull the thorn out. And remember to subscribe, like, and share this with anyone who might need to hear it today. If you're looking for the next step on this journey, I highly suggest you dive into Chapter 8 of the Ashtavakra Gita.
It builds perfectly on this moment, exploring the specific, intricate ways the mind binds itself with desire and the precise mechanics of how it cuts itself free.
It is a phenomenal text. But for now, as you unplug and walk back into the reality of your day, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over.
We spent a lot of time on Janaka's beautiful realization that the universe, with all its chaotic events and dramas, is just a series of waves created by the wind of his own mind blowing across the deep ocean of consciousness.
It's an empowering image. But I want you to really sit with this question as you go about your day-to-day. If the activity of your mind is the wind that creates the very waves of your reality, what happens to your world when the wind simply stops blowing?